Hello and welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken, a senior editor at the Mises Institute, and with me again is Tho Bishop, my associate editor, and it's the day after the 2020 election. We don't have a lot of conclusive information to talk about, but we're going to cover some of the takeaways from this election and what we've learned even with partial return data. So thanks for coming back. Tho, how are you doing?
Trying to keep up with everything going on. It seems that the difficulty in this age of Twitter, you're trying to figure out how many of them are trying to bend the numbers they're seeing, the copium, making themselves feel better at the results or not. So this polarizing world, even hardcore data right now is difficult to find.
Right. With people on Twitter, I can never tell if they're posturing and just trying to whoop up their followers or what exactly they're trying to do. And so, yeah, you're functioning in the dark most of the time with these people. So on this election, though, it looks like it's not a blue wave. I certainly knew some people who predicted a red wave. I was always pretty doubtful about that. But I was always hoping at least that the pollsters would be wrong and there was no blue wave. I wanted actually a very close election. As you could tell maybe in some of my recent writings, I think that it's really close elections that force us to take a hard look at what the story is with democracy and who actually has the moral authority to rule within our current political system. And as it turns out, the country is very closely divided. And it looks like even if Biden can eke out a win, it's going to be super close. It's going to come down to small numbers of votes in a small handful of states. And also, there's going to be questions about how legit are a lot of these votes. And how big of an issue is that? How much are these numbers going to be sliced and diced, though? And how many legal challenges are there going to be? And what do we do when it all comes down to it and we're looking at 1% margins in all of these states?
As a Floridian, I'm just glad that it's not my people that are being made fun of right now in the aftermath of a close election like that. I don't know. You see the way that some of these ballots are coming in. I mean, I know that there's been times where they find 100,000 plus ballots and they all happen to be Joe Biden ballots. It's tracking kind of. It's the sort of conveniently improbable pro-Biden ballot income that it just kind of reminds me of like a country like China, the way they report the GDP data. That's just it's very consistent, very fits the narrative they want to get out there. So I don't know exactly. I know that a lot of these states, like Nevada, for example, they sent ballots out to everyone. So there you're going to have a major issue in kind of ballot harvesting, matching signatures, all that sort of stuff. There will be lawyers. One thing, though, is that I see a lot of Republicans out there saying, oh, well, let's go to the Supreme Court. At least we got that 6-3 margin. Well, guys, guess what? If any Republican out there that thinks that the Supreme Court is going to bail out Donald Trump, no. John Roberts, Justice Roberts' greatest, there's no dream he has, believes in more than the idea of a Supreme Court with 3 Trump appointees siding against him for anything that has to do with his political future, because that itself would be a way of see, we're above politics because we're ruling against Trump. That's exactly what he lives for. And so, again, I don't think the Supreme Court's going to be right in the rescue for Trump at all. Now it's just to see where things end up falling in Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, a few other states. There's hard to take away any firm takeaways on that until Nevada's not going to have anything till till Thursday. So I don't know why in the world it takes a full day for them to even have any updates. But that is a government employees for you.
Well, on the Supreme Court issue, right, they hate ruling on stuff like that. The Supreme Court has its own internal culture. The Supreme Court cares about the prestige of the Supreme Court. This is the number one concern there. It's a very and deeply political institution, very, very concerned with its ability to wield power in Washington. In order to do that, it has to maintain this myth that it's somehow independent. And I had mentioned in a recent article how John Paul Stevens, before he died, had released a book and talked about how disastrous it was for the court in 2000 that they were perceived to be ruling essentially on the outcome of the 2000 election. Now, of course, what they were really saying is that it was up to the state of Florida to certify their own votes and so on. It's not like they were directly handing the election over. But the reality was that the Supreme Court intervened and decided what would happen in Florida. And then that that gave the impression that the Supreme Court was deciding who was president. And they hate that. Stevens said that was terrible. So they don't want to go through that again if they can avoid it. So, of course, I agree with you. The question is how will the 5-4 margin, if you're just assuming that Roberts would vote against Trump, how would that go? I don't know. But yes, of course, I agree that, the Supreme Court they do not want to be in a position where they're just making what could be perceived as a partisan vote on this, because they're looking to the future for other votes that they might take. And they are votes. They're not some sort of like ruling of the philosopher kings. And they've got a longer term view, of course. Some of these people could still be on the court for 20 more years. So they're not just thinking about what happens right now. But looking around at a lot of these states, I mean, no matter what happens, so much of it is going to be discussed as fraud, as invented votes, as just miraculously discovered votes here and there. And it would really shine a light, too, on just the absurdity of the whole system, where you're just sending out ballots, you're not checking ID, you're just accepting ballots from anywhere. And this strikes a lot of people as rather absurd, as it should. You, of course, can't do anything without ID in this country now, except apparently vote. And in the long term, it's hard to see how that will help the legitimacy of our allegedly beloved democratic system.
One of the big benefits in all of this is that, there's not many people that are looking at what's going on and thinking that things are all right. The fact that secession, the Civil War, these are normal mainstream topics now. And, how long this system can last with a universal acknowledgement that it's not working, I don't know. Things can go on for quite a while, but people are recognizing that the civics that were taught in our high school, Schoolhouse Rock style American civics doesn't really apply to the world that most of us are living in right now.
Well, and of course, the mitigating factor in the losing side will be that they'll control some other institution. So it's looking like the Senate will remain GOP, the House will remain controlled by Democrats, even though Republicans picked up seats in the House. So, and conceivably, the Republicans could actually pick up a one-vote ruling margin in the House, although that seems unlikely, but it still seems maybe possible based on current returns. But let's just assume that the Republicans control the Senate, the Democrats control the House. So whoever then wins the presidency, then the losing side on that could say, well, at least we have X. And I think that would then prevent any wholesale really revolt from the current declared winner, whoever that might be in January. And that would prevent and stave off some sort of serious continued talk of civil war. But the problem is what if that continues over time? And what if you have if you have one party that comes out on the losing side over and over again, and then you start to have what's basically a permanent minority, and that starts to lead to serious problems then for your country. But before we get to that, which we'll cover in a little bit more detail, let's talk about the pollsters. So, the first thing we got to acknowledge is there's no blue wave, but that then takes us directly to the issue of the failure of the pollsters. And just how badly did they fail, though?
You look down the line, Florida, I think, is one of the best examples out there. Even going into, late last week, I think even yesterday, Nate Silver, and in spite of the way that, voting turnouts were looking, he was doubling down, saying, "Oh well, we're just seeing incredible steadiness in these polls," and so he moved Florida from like a toss-up state to being a lean blue state, and Trump's performance there was incredible yesterday. I mean, his performance in Miami-Dade in particular is the story there. And the Cuban vote is massive. The thing though is that again, I think this is something that we touched on a little bit. I did a few interviews leading up to the election on this. Is that polling? I think right now it's asking the wrong question in terms of how these elections actually go. Modern elections about turnout. It's not about persuasion, and the model. These people become so reliant upon what they think that they can model in terms of what the electorate's going to look like. They especially in an election like this where the turnout was so large. There's an arrogance in the way they're using their math, and I think there's a lot of common ground that with some of the other issues that we have, econometric, economic modeling. Even some of the modeling with the coronavirus, these in spite of these massive data failings, I don't think they're going to learn a lot of lessons. But so much of the narrative, be it early the polling, be it the blue wave stuff. You're gonna have this massive move away from seniors on Trump that didn't really play out in Florida. Trump's obvious racism is going to turn off things. The coalition's bigger than ever. The media's narratives, I think, are the biggest loser. I think was the media, and the way that so much of the stuff they put up, people just aren't buying it anymore, and it's their credibility, I think, is just absolutely shot to anyone that's paying attention.
Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, right? Because so much of what the pollsters do really comes down to something of a union they have with the media, an agreement, a concerted effort that they do together. Because, of course, the pollsters themselves, they're all very careful to hedge their bets behind the scenes, right? Well, there's this margin of error. And look at, if you drill down into the numbers, I wasn't really that wrong. And people who are easily manipulated fall for that. When you look at just how wrong Silver was in his proclamations, they'll come back and say, oh, well, if you look closely at the numbers, Silver wasn't actually that wrong once you take into account the stated errors, et cetera, et cetera. Except that's not what really was happening. That's not the message. Because if that was really the message, those pollsters would have been out there saying, well, the fact is these races are too close to call. The fact is we're not quite sure what's happening. The fact is these are toss-ups. But they weren't saying that. They were saying, this is what's going to happen. This guy has a huge lead. This is a 90% chance of coming to pass, and so on. And so what they're doing is they're using the media to amplify these very certain conclusions. And it's all, from the media's perspective, all to the service of then manipulating the overall population and teaching us to expect a certain result and so on. And perhaps demoralizing one side, etc. And so to come back and say, well, really, if you look at, if you read the fine print on what Silver was saying, he wasn't really saying that it was a lopsided Biden win. And that's you're pretty gullible if you're buying into that idea, because it's very clear what the message was. The message was lopsided Biden win. The message was blue wave. And yeah, I get it. I went to grad school too, where we spent endless hours on all this statistical stuff. And sure, yep, when when you look at his methods, yep, he's admitting that there's a margin of error and so on. But that's not what he told the media, and that's not what he would say when he went on TV. And he spoke with complete confidence on this issue and setting up himself as an expert who knew what was going to happen. And that was the media narrative. And the media happily used those pollsters who helped create the narrative that the media wanted to agree with. And yeah, it's really hard to divide the two, actually. In fact, in many cases, a lot of these pollsters literally work for these same media organizations that then write these stories on that and make these pronouncements. And that makes it easier then to claim that maybe there was some sort of fraud or something wasn't happening that was completely above board. But in the end, both sides are going to be able to say that. Seems pretty clear that no matter who wins, the other side's going to say, well, if all this trickery hadn't happened, we would have had a clear victory. But I I don't see how either side can really claim a clear victory at this point.
No, not at all. And one of the things that'd be interesting though is that the actual active legislation with again, let's assume right now that Joe Biden's going to win. Let's assume that the Republicans keep the Senate. Let's assume that the Democrats maintain the House with a lower margin than they did last time around. The biggest losers in this, in my opinion, are the AOC squad caucus of kind of the genuine left legislators, because you look at these numbers. Pelosi is a let's make a deal sort of person. Biden is a let's make a deal sort of guy. Anything that they want to get done through Congress, they're going to need moderate Republicans more than they're going to need the left. And I think you could also see this very, very scary sort of thing is that not hard to imagine Bernie Sanders becomes Secretary Sanders for like the Department of Labor or something like that. They get him out there. So the legislating side of it for the left, I think they might end up being a lot less relevant under a Biden administration than Trump, which is not a surprise, right? They were only convenient as kind of a weapon against Trump. And it's going to be interesting. I think they're going to start realizing that all this great press that they got from the corporate media, once it's Biden's in charge, they're not going to get such fawning praise because they're not going to have the same utility that they did over the last 4 years. So that if there's any good thing out there, see how their long-term projections still might be. I'm not ruling out the left's rise in America, but in the short term, real politics, I think that the hardcore political left is also one of those losers out there.
Yeah, I agree. I think if anyone was proven right in this, it was the old Democratic Guard, the people who wanted a candidate who was seen as moderate, who was seen as a friend of the old working class, and so on. And they never really liked the whole identity politics thing, the whole LGBTQ thing. They, of course, liked it always to the extent that it would help with fundraising. But for the most part, I think they were never quite comfortable with that, and they've been proven quite correct. I still maintain that Trump has never been an especially strong candidate, that his greatest ally has always been the ineptitude and the extremism of the Democratic Party and the comments that these people are always making about how most of America is filled with racists and deplorables and that sort of thing. And that just causes people to flee then to the Republican Party. And they've done it again. And I, as you say, I don't think the pollsters were really anticipating that. They were too much stuck in the past and not really looking at what turnout would bring. So now we've got, circling back to the issue of this election's a tie, now what? And, well, what does that say about democracy? We've always been told, being brought up, that, well, you have the democratic will, you have the will of the people, you have a mandate. This will then translate policy into what the voters want. But what is that policy? Who could say? There's no clear path forward for this is what the country wants. This is what the mandate is for. And it would seem at this point that any politician who comes out and says, well, I'm just doing what the voters sent me to Washington to do, would be obviously making this claim based on nothing, at least at the presidential level. Clearly, if you're a member of Congress and your constituents are deep blue or deep red, then you can make that claim. But once you start to get up even to the level of senator or president, pretty hard to see how you're doing what the voters sent you to do, especially since we have so many states that are split essentially right down the middle too. Because so many of the states were looking at 50.1, 51% victory margins. And this is just a really close election, not just for the one national race, but for a lot of these statewide races as well.
Absolutely. And what's going to be interesting is that, the turnout here, how much of this is purely just the product of kind of the massive increase in mail-in votes, things like that. Are we going to see this level of participation going forward? If so, that's going to definitely change, I think, some of the dynamics out there in terms of the way the Republicans campaign or the way that some of these things go. But yeah, it's, what will be interesting to see is how state governments react. Because now, we saw how state legislatures that were red under Obama kind of that Romney, Paul Ryan sort of era, they didn't do a whole lot in terms of, they did not act the same way that Governor Newsom did in California, the same way that Andrew Cuomo did in New York. It would be very interesting to see whether Trump's brand of republicanism, if he loses, assuming he loses, whether that carries down in the way that state Republican governments act in a blue America. Because if that's the case, then this might just keep this growing, this march towards getting real about decentralization, getting real about challenging this centralized federal down approach of things in a way that could be beneficial in the long run.
Well, it really does emphasize the importance of the state level election, right? The redistricting, the control of who counts the votes, your state secretary of state, all of those local officials who cover how the votes are counted. These are very important issues and are key in determining national outcomes. So it might help really illustrate for a lot of voters that if you're sitting home in the off year when there's a gubernatorial race and a state legislative race, maybe you shouldn't if you're really concerned about the outcome. Because yes, these things will pretty clearly have repercussions in states that are closely divided and where perhaps Democrats control those sorts of officials and those narratives where we have declared that Biden is the winner because we found all these votes. We're going to count votes in a certain way. These votes are in, those votes are out. A lot of that is decided by local officials. In fact, virtually all of it. There's very little direct federal intervention in how these votes are counted at that level. And this has always been true historically, where states are primarily in charge of this. And back to the issue of tie elections, we could look back to 1876. I've mentioned the election of 1876 in a couple of articles recently. I never thought it would come this close to playing out like that, although I certainly thought it was a possibility. But in 1876, for example, you had at least 3 states where they sent in 2 different slates of electoral college votes, where you had competing factions within those states who decided that, oh, we won. No, we won. And so we'll send in our results. So it ended up being up to Congress to figure that out and to determine who got what votes. And that's quite possible. We all just assume that everyone at the state level is going to agree on who won, but these people are highly motivated to make sure their side wins. And there can be different power bases within a single state. And you should probably be aware of that stuff. You should probably pay attention to that stuff. There are races other than the presidency, and those state level races can have a huge effect. But beyond that, then, what if you keep having ties over and over and over again? And I noted how in the late 19th century, you had the Republicans who clearly dominated the presidential races, but the Democrats, who were the good laissez-faire party back then, won on several occasions the popular vote, well, specifically on 2 occasions where they still lost the election, and then in some other occasions where it was very, very close. So in 1884, very, very close. Cleveland did manage to win. 600 vote change in New York would have changed the whole outcome and would have had yet another case where the Dems won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. The same thing happened in 1876. The Dems won the popular vote, lost the Electoral College. And then again in 1888, that happened. And then finally, the Dems managed to get a big victory in 1892. But that didn't last, and the whole alliance then ended up breaking down in 1896, where the whole laissez-faire party alignment ended, and there hasn't been a laissez-faire party since. But that we came through a period where there were these very close elections with it going back and forth, and the popular vote winner losing the election, and there was real talk of civil war and disunion over this period. And by the way, people were not civil to each other. This was the period of where the slogan among Republicans was the Democrats are the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion, by which they mean drunks, Catholics, and former rebels. And there was a whole habit of waving the bloody shirt, right? If you vote Democrat, you're voting in favor of those people who murdered your uncle in the Civil War and so on. And I don't think we should look to that period as a stable and serene period, although it may, in fact, be a better descriptor of what's going on. But that period is very useful because it gives us an idea of how coalitions form and how new political alliances form in order to overcome problems of past instability, which may or may not happen. It's not guaranteed that the country moves back towards stability. It may just actually break up. But the question then is, what are these party coalitions going forward? Can there be a situation where one of the parties manages to hammer out a coalition of voters that can assert a real and convincing majority? Or are we looking at just a continuation of slugfests every 4 years where it's more or less evenly divided?
The polarization of America is to the point where, once upon a time you had, the getting deals done kind of was the priority. And then one of the biggest, just from kind of a legislative perspective, the getting rid of earmarks kind of gummed up the works there, because the being able to trade pork spending was one of the best ways of getting things done. These days, it's such a polarized world that you're playing to different bases that they're operating in different wavelengths. And I think during this election, you see it with kind of the way that Trump's numbers happen, and the narrative right now is that, imagine if there wasn't the coronavirus, Trump would have won in a landslide. And I think it would definitely have helped him right now. But Trump's grounding with his supporters, has hardly been affected with anything. The last 4 years, it's been rock solid. And I think that's been true with the people that really hate him. There's kind of that small sliver in the middle that's been going back and forth. So, the idea that democracy creates, it's going to bring the country together to empower us to forge on. It's coalitions going against each other. Politics is war by other means, and historically, Republicans have not been particularly good at that fight. Trump's changed some of their tone and tactics. We'll see if that continues to be a lasting legacy.
Well, that's the question, right? There's all this talk about working class white voters, and certainly they seem to be more involved and have changed, at least in the Rust Belt, their former alliances in many cases. Can they build on that, though? Can they build up small business owners? Also, how about working class Hispanics? I know that they did well in Florida with the Cubans, but can they extend that beyond that to, say, Mexican Americans in the Southwest? It looks like he improved his performance there, but not enough to make any of these states go in favor of Trump. And Trump has always been pretty weak out west, and the Trump coalition. There really isn't a large white working class in places like Colorado, in the sense of there was never a big labor union presence in Colorado, for example. There's never been those Rust Belt elements that you see in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, and so on. And so it's unclear who Trump would actually be speaking to in Colorado. And so it's not surprising that George W. Bush did much better in Colorado, and actually, I believe, managed to win in 2004 and 2000. And that seems like 100 years ago now, but clearly a totally different kind of candidate. And I don't know if that alliance could endure and be built upon. But it does seem that the Democratic Party feels more and more like it's the party of people with high earnings, people with graduate degrees, people who hang out in upper middle class white suburbs. That seems to be the core of it, with a smaller number of people who are in certain ethnic groups who then vote along with them. But all of those people in the middle, they don't seem to be particularly interested in what the Dems are selling right now. Or at least there's very close division. And so it looks like there's a realignment going on, but I have no idea what the outcome might be.
Well, what's interesting is that for all of the narrative out there, and again, this goes back to the media just being a fraud, and I think people recognizing it. I mean, Trump did better with non-white voters in 2016 than the Republican Party had done in a presidential election in quite a while. I mean, even with the Bush years. So and then that only grew significantly this time around. I mean, Trump's turnout with the Cuban population in Florida was just insane. And obviously, I mean, Cuban voters have always been more conservative politically, but I mean, there's never been like that sort of enthusiasm. Marco Rubio couldn't generate that sort of enthusiasm with Cuban voters in Florida. Trump did. And I think that kind of goes to that same sort of, a lot of it, I think, is that personality that made him resonate with non-college educated, white voters in the Rust Belt in 2016. There's a little bit of that machismo that I think a lot of voters, some communities just kind of they appreciate that, they respect that. But it wasn't just Cuban voters in Texas or in Florida where you saw that. I mean, there were, I think the NBC, Telemundo, I think something had projecting that Trump was going to lose by 40% the Hispanic vote in Texas. I mean, it looks like it's going to be less than half of that based on exit polls. That Trump's going to do about 40% total, rather than down 40 points. So that's a big swing there. You see that reflected in other demographics. So it's not just Cuban Hispanics there. And yeah, I mean, I think the more and more the Democratic Party plays itself as the party of coastal elites, of cultural values that do not resonate well with most of the country, and their militant dedication to this very culturally Marxist political correctness. That just doesn't play well at all. I think I mentioned last episode the Hidden Tribes studies on the way that various different groups, from looking at it from not a partisan lens, but a few different cultural lenses, how the political correctness issue is a major turnoff for people. I think that there's a big political readjustment, realignment that is going on, and I don't think that the outcome, whatever, when the dust settles here, stops any of that. I think these shifts are going to continue to happen in ways that will every year it seems that every election or every few elections, one side says, oh, well, this is this is the election that ends history, that the other party is going to be a permanent minority party. It never really works out that way, often just because of the arrogance of whatever party has power. They end up squandering their capital in a big way, and I think that was definitely true with Obama era Democrats. And I do not think that that's going to change going forward.
You're right. They do say that every 4 years, that whoever won now has a permanent majority. So, yeah, that's been going on for at least 20 years that I remember, people saying things like that. Thank you very much for joining us on Radio Rothbard. We'll be back in the future when we have more information on how this election is turning out. But until then, have a wonderful week.